I'm Dr. Garret Castleberry, Professor of Media Production and Communication at Mid-America Christian University. And joining me on this Mass Communication Perspectives season of the pod is an outgoing student intern and freshly christened graduate of Media Production and Communication, Annabeth Fehrle. How are you today?
I'm doing amazing. I'm so happy to be here per usual. Like you just mentioned, I just graduated last weekend. I just got my bachelor's in communications and media production with a little emphasis in some business admin, but I like to stick to the Comm program more than anything. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. Happy to add some commentary into our readings from this week. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You've been a valuable contributor in the classroom, but it's exciting to have you contributing outside of the classroom. Yes. And increasingly, that's one of our goals and objectives is to make learning more transformative and work on ways to innovate out of, I guess, those traditional boundaries. Yes. And here we are leaning into some of your strengths. One of those strengths, by the way, is that you have a natural curiosity for Comm curriculum, for theories, for the ways in which our discipline negotiates its ideas, and maybe for a little bit of a background. These disciplines can be there is what a colloquial term, the silo effect, and it could be thought of as relating to the ivory tower mentality, where university disciplines exist in these silos, right? Or you kind of like, you think about the medieval towers. Yes. And they are kind of separated physically and maybe separated intellectually as a result also. And, the truth of the matter is, for a discipline like communication, we have a shared history that's really rich. And I've always been one of those that leans into that shared history. In fact, it's part of what encourages me to be more interdisciplinary, which is semi-controversial because many like to maintain traditional boundaries. But communication studies shares a lot of root theories with sociology, with philosophy, and through the study of rhetoric. Rhetoric not only threads through philosophy, it also threads through English, and so we have this rich history throughout the humanities, but it also lends itself to the social sciences and even the business world. So many of our organizational communication scholars and strategic communication scholars go on to be upper tier representatives, leaders within schools of business. And so there is real synergy at the heart of Comm. And I'm a big advocate of spotlighting that. I think it's a strength, not a weakness. And anyway, we have a couple of theories in these next conversations that do come from some of that shared history, and I think that's a little bit appropriate to acknowledge. But what's fun about our field is new scholars come around and then they find updated ways to form discussions about it, including the discussion that we're going to pull from for today. So remind us what text are we leaning into for these conversations in our mass perspectives?
Yeah, so we're still reading our communication theory and millennial popular culture book. We're doing chapter 11, Nope versus Pope, a fantasy theme analysis of Scandal versus Parks and Recreation, written by Crystal Fogel. So this was a fun read. It definitely was. I think that it showed how fantasy themes can give us an interesting image of governments and societies in a different way, because all of us are going to have our view on government and politics, but these shows both show a different perspective of it. So yeah,
we were, as a matter of fact, we were having, as would be appropriate, as is normative, we're having some off mic conversations, just warming up, just kind of reconnecting. We both had a busy week last week, so we're getting back in rhythm here, and we were discussing the ebbs and flows of just social progress and how inevitably our political decisions, our majorities, our minorities are tethered to that, because they are those public forums through which we work out ideas about difference about progress or about maintaining, quote unquote, the status quo, that is to say, the way things are. And all of these have healthy roles in the maintaining of a functioning society. And you can either be a high functioning society or a low functioning society. And I think these tensions will always exist. In fact, in a democratic space, it is said that we should champion the fact that democracy is a messy process, that it should be intentionally messy, because you never want one single strand or idea or group to just fully dominate not only the discourse, but the political decisions, right? The things that kind of form and function and move bodies and people and communities and collectives and states and so on. And yet, we can see at the same time, of course, that complete fragmentation, to use a postmodern term there, complete fragmentation of everything can result in civil unrest, if not anarchy, and it can destabilize some of those systems. Now, those are extremes. This chapter is not about extremes.
No, it's not.
And in fact, it is using, like this book intends, popular culture as a way of both expressing and interpreting how ideas work, how communication forms. And so Fogel, the author of this chapter in Kathleen Glenister Roberts' Communication Theory and Millennial Popular Culture, Essays and Applications, is drawing in two different TV artifacts for consideration. So let me ask you this, Annabeth. We got two TV texts here, and you can be transparent for a conversation. We've got Scandal, which was a series that ran for about 5, 6, 7 years. It aired on broadcast network television. It aired on ABC, as memory serves me correctly. But then it probably experienced second life on streaming.
Yeah.
And I do remember it being, it would be on the mainstays. It would be on Netflix, when Netflix used to invest heavily in the leasing model of taking other people's highly sought after programs
shows.
and then they basically lease, rent them and air it.
Yep.
And this can actually build an audience where one didn't exist before.
That happened to me with Breaking Bad. I missed it on the mainstream and it showed up on Netflix, and I was like, this show's awesome.
So that's a great example, as a matter of fact, because Breaking Bad might be one of the alpha artifacts that it became so popular because of Netflix, not because of AMC where it aired originally, the cable channel, that people found it on Netflix, and then the ratings, and this used to never happen for shows on traditional television, the ratings rose as the seasons progressed, including all the way up until the end. It kept going up because audiences were finding and, as we like to say, binging that program on Netflix. And so much so that people would begin to mistake Netflix as the home base for it.
Correct.
And another text that experienced that same outcome, but in a different way, would be Arrested Development. Arrested Development was a very innovative sitcom that aired on Fox and was on the bubble every year. It was on TV and aired essentially 2.5 seasons. So it had a shortened season in there, but only had 3 seasons, canceled twice, I believe. And yet it found life later on Netflix, kind of like The Office did. The Office was kind of allowed to have its lifespan as a show on NBC, but people found it on streaming and found it in what we call reruns or syndication later. It's the enormous audience for these shows didn't exist when it was actually being made. And this is how it was for Breaking Bad in its first 3 seasons, and this is how it was for sitcoms like Arrested Development and in The Office, and so these artifacts can gain as I said, a second life through streaming or through syndication in ways that TV shows didn't always benefit from in the past. But that being said, this is a pair of smaller broadcast network shows. Scandal was a political drama that centered on, I'm going to forget the titles because I was always familiar with the discourse about Scandal, the people watching it and talking about it. It was on at a time where I was doing a lot of research in television and kind of focusing a lot of scholarly interest on, and so being in the rhythms of what critics were saying, how they were writing about it, how they were exploring those texts, and what it did for its maybe awareness and popularity was valuable to me then. So I was aware of its discourse, but wasn't a steady follower of Scandal. And I think you have a similar lack of familiarity with the show, but we both have watched Parks and Rec, and so we have some familiarity there. I remember it was as The Office was in its latter years, it was not a spinoff, but it was from the same creative minds, and it was almost made as if it's a similar formula of a mockumentary that takes place around small local government in a fictional Pawnee, Indiana. And so its goal is kind of slice of life, middle of America type of approach to what is often more of a congested TV space of stories that take place in exciting locations, right? The big bustling city or exotic locations, that are harder to get to for the average person. So TV can function as these grand fantasy narratives. And here's a show that was kind of, it actually is a callback to a certain kind of sitcom that aired years and years ago, right? There was I'm going to get the letters wrong, KRHB or something like that, Cincinnati, or these the kind of Mary Tyler Moore era of sitcoms where they would carve something out in the I think of Laverne and Shirley in Milwaukee and so on, and so there's a flavor to that, but it's very much in the new documentary style that The Office and Arrested Development before it, and then after it, and even what's the Modern Family would also be capitalized on in terms of its structure.
Well, sorry, I'm gonna say something real quick. I think that they decided to make it like a small fantasy, like hometown, because they wanted it to relate to audiences a little bit more in this fantasy theme that we're kind of talking about. I actually worked at a community center a while back.
Okay.
And so I understood the show on like a different level, because it is similar to how it works a little bit in real life too, but I also think that they had the same characters in every show. They had a different problem with solution, building it up every season, because it relates to our audiences a little bit more. And it's more of a political comedy kind of show instead of a political drama or government drama like Scandal. And for me, I think Parks and Rec is a little bit lighter compared to Scandal, and I think that's why I watched it a little bit more,
Well, and it is, there is a lighthearted spirit to it, whereas even though you could perceive, I think this show began as somewhat of, many would claim a carbon copy of what The Office was attempting to pull off, which was the kind of, the central character is the foil instead of the protagonist. And the Michael Scott character in The Office he's the foil of everything. There's a lot of humor to come from him, but there's a lot of misery as well, in his unique social persona. And thus it become this showcase for comedian Steve Carell, who had dabbled in different things, kind of came from some of that improv background, but also cut his teeth a little bit on The Daily Show and Comedy Central, whereas Amy Poehler was positioned to be the lead here. She's coming off a 6-7 year run on SNL, on Saturday Night Live. She was a glue gal, right? People talk about the glue guys in sports or in ensemble elements, and she was a glue gal that they could plug and play. into so many different venues on SNL, and even vaulted into that. She co-hosted the Weekend Update segment, which is typically reserved for one of the head writers of the show, or the senior talents on that show. So she was getting that push. And Parks and Rec, I mentioned Scandal aired on ABC for a handful of seasons. Parks and Rec aired on NBC. It literally kind of spun out of that time slot, that kind of post office time slot. And so they were trying to embed something. Both these shows aired before. They were also having some critical success with the show 30 Rock at the time. It was an awards darling, 30 Rock, highly intelligent, but a lot of zany slapstick to it as well. But its audience was even smaller. And so these shows what's significant here is these shows were an enormous departure from the cataclysmic success NBC had with sitcoms in the 1990s, especially. In the 80s, they had mega hits like Cheers and The Cosby Show. And then in the 90s, they just skyrocketed. And it was all about sitcoms. Cheers was still on in the early 90s. Then it spun off into Frasier, which was both an audience and critical darling. Same time period. Friends is going to become a mega hit, this enormous hit. And then on top of that, they had Seinfeld running all those years as well, which many consider, an elite in the pantheon of TV sitcoms. And all these shows either had kind of some carbon copies or even spin-offs. There were smaller shows like Wings and so many others that were attempting those same ideas. Mad About You was more of a kind of New York City-based domestic dramedy, right? Helen Hunt, Paul Reiser. And so NBC had it on lockdown, this situation comedy. And they had to pivot to a new norm in the 2000s where audiences began shrinking. After so many consecutive decades of television viewership going up, 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 it was shrinking. Now, at first, this shrinking was because of declines in, the pluralization of TV programming, cable, satellite, this proliferation of channels existed. And out of that, you're going to have the splintering of your audience. And so they had to learn how to eat, eat well with less coming in. And so these shows had a little bit different of a dynamic in that their stakes were that the low initial audience numbers for these shows would have had them canceled in the 90s. That's significant to remember. And they were just kind of getting by at a smaller clip. But this show is being spotlighted by Fogel for this fantasy theme analysis. So let's wind back the clock though and kind of note where fantasy theme analysis is in a way a spin-off, right? It kind of spins off of, and the author elaborates using an excerpt. If you want to read the excerpt on symbolic convergence theory, Fogel incorporates an excerpt here. Do you want to read that one?
So in symbolic convergence, the term fantasy means the creative and imaginative shared interpretation of events that fulfills a group psychological or rhetorical need to make sense of its experience and anticipate its future.
So when we're using this term fantasy, this doesn't mean we're not talking about wizards and dragons. We're not talking about illicit dreams, right? Or sort of like innate human desires, that type. These kinds of that's a syntax that gets coded with these kinds of terms. But instead, what this relates to is how, as in the real world, not just in these fictional shows, in the real world, we in group situations and settings will create or co-create. That's an important term. We're going to co-create certain formulas or fantasy themes that we will cling to, and this spins off once again from Ernest Borman's Symbolic Convergence Theory. This was a famous piece published in QJS, Quarterly Journal of Speech, way back in 1972. And so when you think about that type of history, It was a formative essay that helps establish in academic language a phenomenon that's been observed and can be replicable, right, and thus substantiated. And then it gains momentum and kind of ingrains itself into the vocabulary of the discipline. And then all these years later, we get these offshoots of it through which fantasy theme analysis emerges. And so, what kinds of fantasy themes stood out to you from this chapter, or how did that content, I guess, connect with you on a reader level?
These fantasy themes that we're seeing, we have the same set of characters in every episode pretty much, especially in Parks and Rec, but it sets that psychological need that it was talking about in the Symbolic Convergence to have a sense of experience with those characters. You have the same characters in every episode, and you have a different conflict and a different solution in every episode, but that's what has people coming back, because you get a sense of familiarity with these characters, And so we have Leslie Knope, okay? She's the main character. We have two main lead females in both of these shows. Leslie Knope, she has extreme optimism, in every episode. We see her take on these challenges, and I think she goes against the stereotypical, I don't know what I'm trying to get to here, challenges, I guess. And it is fantasy because it's a little bit unrealistic, I guess.
Well, it's an exaggerated.
It's an exaggerated. Sure. Yeah. That's what I was getting to.
Yeah.
In a sense, but I love that show. I think it's great. It has people coming back because it's enjoyable, and it does have a sense of you have the same characters but a different conflict, I guess. I don't know.
Well, let's unveil a few of these characters and then kind of put them in conversation with how they impact the overall structure of the show, and maybe how they create a few fantasy themes. You mentioned Amy Poehler as the lead, as Leslie Knope. I referenced that the show started as a bit of a carbon copy of The Office, but the early season, notoriously, they didn't work in many ways and staggered out of the gates because they were trying to write this Knope character like a Michael Scott. And it wasn't working, and something wasn't clicking yet in the formula of the show.
Right.
And so between that shorter first season and season 2, they retooled her to just decide, we don't want her to be a foil like Scott. We want her to be this untouchable optimist, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's just lean into it as a strength, not a weakness. And so instead of playing the idiot foil that Scott is so often, recognized as, it's more like she's adrift in her own idealism for wanting things to be the best they can be.
Yeah.
And simply that she's surrounded by down-to-earth realists who aren't necessarily, at first at least, sharing that vision in the same way, including who's also not quite an antagonist in any way, but ideologically different, Ron Swanson, played by Nick Offerman. And so, he has a very cynical view of government versus her optimistic outlook, and so there's tension that's allowed to play out there.
It's funny because he always shuts down her ideas because he works in government to make people do or have things done the least way possible. Like, he doesn't want anything to change. He's very against the change, but at the same time you see him support Leslie through all her endeavors in every way possible, really.
Well, and he very much embodies this ideological political belief of limited government. because he doesn't believe in it. And this is an ironic juxtaposition, because here's someone working in government that doesn't believe in it, and so he's got that cynical outlook. But it's more harmless than harmful, ultimately, in terms of he has humanity. And also, over the course of time, he'll be, in at least some small ways, persuaded to at least not be in the way of Knope's own progress. And I think there are some slow burn admirable qualities that emerge as a result. We also have what starts as an underling to Leslie, but then eventually will shift to under Ron. Aubrey Plaza plays April.
Yes, I love April.
April is, and the reason she kind of gravitates in a certain direction, she's a little bit of a cynic as well, but she really comes at it from a different generation. She kind of has perhaps like a millennial cynicism versus Ron Swanson he's very coded as Gen X, right? Which Gen X was kind of seen as that lost generation between the baby boomers and the much louder millennials. He's kind of embodying certain qualities there. We also have a bit of a tragic clown figure and Jerry, kind of running joke played by Jim O'Hare, and who's really just kind of an office worker there with him, as well as a younger, more comical foil to things, Andy, played by
I love Andy.
Chris Pratt, right? It's kind of a pre-MCU, pre-buffed out.
He's just
Chris
there
Pratt.
to be there.
And he's embodying this sort of it's a young. It could be a late millennial, even young Gen Z kind of a goofball spirit about things, right? He's not taking life too seriously yet because he doesn't have to, and that's okay, and we get a lot out of that. And then just for conversation's sake, we do have Leslie's close friend, played by Rashida Jones, Ann Perkins, and she kind of had made a jump. That was another connection of she was cast in the third season of The Office, and then it was a little bit of a stunt cast that it was meant to be more of that temporary role, or perhaps they decided it would be a temporary role, and then she jumped over to this where they could flesh out a character more so. And then later on we'll have Adam Scott and Rob Lowe join the cast as this other pair of male influences into this world. But one name I'm forgetting that's worth mentioning would be Aziz Ansari.
Tom Haverford.
And who plays Tom Haverford. And he's over the top eccentric, and he really embodies some qualities that I see in this social media age, right? Of the social media generation, especially for a small town. He's always leaning into things.
He wants to be so fresh, like have the newest invention on the market. He wants to be.
He's got entrepreneurial spirit, but he also doesn't. He's if many of these characters are down to earth, he is out of orbit.
Yes.
Because he has unrealistic expectations for everything from how to manage money to, being responsible.
Even the ideas are a little bit...
Oh, absolutely.
Crazy. Absolutely.
And he has a counterpart in some ways, kind of like the person he can bounce ideas off of and often receive some type of positive support, whether it's genuine or, a kind of toying with him. That's Donna. Played by Retta, and Donna and Tom. Here's what I wanted to tie in was what I see as a fantasy theme that emerges from the show was this slogan, this catchphrase, "Treat yourself."
I was just about to talk about this.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Well, walk us through this.
This is something that I often say because I'll be out like running errands or something, and I'm like, I want a little sweet treat or something. I'm like, you gotta treat yourself. Like, it's a very played off slogan that I use a lot in my life.
Well,
but it's unrealistic.
If we break it down, it has a kind of political meaning to it. It is a very much a carpe diem, seize the day. It is a live in the moment type of mentality and approach to things, whether it's budgeting, expenditures, leisurely pursuits, and so on, but even entrepreneurial things like that this idea of like high risk, high reward.
Yes.
And so I found when I was taking some mental notes before we sat down, treat yourself, to me felt like a fantasy theme, particularly because it caught on and then both resonated in the show, and then it becomes one of these things that steps outside of the show. Like people start to share that extra textually, right? In The Office and The Simpsons before that, and Seinfeld, like these shows that were cleverly written, will have these moments of little dialogues, little quips and things, and they transcend the text. They transcend culture. Well, they become fantasy themes, right? If we think about it in the context of the show, Treat Yourself is about finding everyday pleasures in the life that you have, even if it's not the life you envision for yourself. And that was a carryover that I thought, and I've been doing some rewatches of certain seasons of The Office right now. That's a theme that's slow burning in that show, is learning how to be less miserable in your job and find more contentment.
Yeah.
And they do it through finding community with one another.
Absolutely.
And that is what's happening here as well, right? That these characters, that they're pointing in different directions in terms of what they want out of life and what they want out of work and what they want out of each other. And there is a gelling effect where they do influence one another.
For sure.
In different ways, not always in the same direction, but that crossover effect has resonance, right? That takes hold. Did any other fantasy themes come to mind as you were processing the show based on your viewing experiences?
Well, I'm actually going to piggyback off of what you just said, because yeah, you see them make their lives less miserable by finding things inside their job to do. In The Office, we have them do the Office Olympics, or they just go out for the day. Absolutely. And go out to eat or whatever.
The pretzel day.
Yeah,
right?
pretzel day.
This
yeah.
Desperate
they
way
just,
to.
Yeah. And then I know in Parks and Rec they had a cook-off one time with, I forgot his name, but Rob Lowe, his character, and then Ron, they have a burger cook-off, vegan versus a regular beef patty. I don't know. It was just, it's interesting to see that connection made in that way, because that is part of why the show is so enjoyable,
You're hitting on another theme, and I couldn't quite put it to words or paper before we sat down, but I was always fascinated by Ron Swanson's character. He's clearly libertarian, right?
Yes.
He's a bearded man who wants to live in the woods and be left alone, and we're seeing that. But he's a gentle soul in that way, even if he's an absolute grump. And we're seeing that was a real ideology that was emerging, like a framed personification in male culture in the U.S. It is, even when it's seeking to be apolitical, that is to say disconnected, it's very much a political statement to do that. And so Ron Swanson kind of became a meme, right? So while this show may have only been pulling 4 million viewers a week, let's say, in a live broadcast, the memification of Ron Swanson's looks and quips about the ineffectiveness of government kind of grew into fantasy themed discourse that would maybe be shared in things like where I'm talking extra textual, that is to say outside of the text, shared in on Facebook posts, in private texts, in group texts, in group chats and things like that. So these fantasy texts, I'm kind of taking us outside of the boundaries of the essay that we looked at, and that the essay that students are reading. These texts are doing this different business that is transcendent, right? That kind of elevates them to something else. And I would say just even the persona of Ron Swanson came to symbolize something else, right? A convergent theory, right, if you will, about maybe the crossroads of where American masculinity was and what we wanted out of political identity at a time. So this show aired during, it's never a coincidence, but this show, The Office, was in its second half of its lifespan, airing while we were going through a real life recession. And this show emerges we're coming out of the recession, but we're deep into the Obama administration years. And so that's where we were seeing in popular culture these tensions play out of those got different kinds of spotlights, those types of political venues, and people were wanting a retreat or a retrenchment to something simpler, something more relatable. And this kind of gives us something in a small town. Now it's really interesting to think back, because the nature. This won't tie into Scandal, but people can kind of draw the connections here. But I'm going to stick with Parks and Rec as our kind of focal conversation.
I think it's more seen probably by...
Later in the show, there was a cameo by Joe Biden. Back when he was still like cool Uncle Joe with the aviator sunglasses on.
I remember this.
So Leslie Knope idolizes Joe Biden because he had built up a stern political reputation as a career public servant. You know, always took the train from Delaware to D.C. Like, somewhat, a lot of his political decisions seem to align with some quintessential middle of the road American values. Now, what's interesting, of course, is this show would end, and then his political career has taken on different layers that couldn't have been anticipated. Right? He has both become to some a hero figure, and then absolutely a tragic figure, and then one of even political intrigue, but also controversy. And none of that was playing out in the public sphere when he was being brought into the fantasy theme of the show as something to be emulated by Leslie Knope, who is a virtuous character. She's not a scandalous figure. She's not taken to controversy. She's not corrupt, and that was part of honestly, that could be a fantasy theme in of itself, is how she is presented as an idyllic version of what it means to want to work in government, and thus the show could aspire to transcend just comedic television and then become something more like a vehicle to encourage people to not lose hope.
Well, that's actually my one discussion question that I had for this chapter was, do you think that these fantasy themes found, specifically we can just stick to Parks and Rec, influence real life political attitudes or behaviors?
I do, because I would see it firsthand play out, even at closed venues like academic conferences. People were drawing real influence, we say, being encouraged by these fictional characters. And that's a curious thing to be in. And that's not an outlier example, by the way. I think people are influenced by fictional characters, whether they are heroes or villains, whether they are, working moms or stay-at-home dads. I do think we get a lot of influence from media culture that speaks to its overwhelming persuasive power, and that thus reminds us that these artifacts, it's not that they are worthy because they're so important to be studying, like, oh, it's so important that you complete this mass media project and study media, but they are, their persuasive power warrants, that is to say, calls us to be able to make astute, close readings and analyses of them because of how much they can influence us in any number of directions. So there we see how a very simple, a very small program like a Parks and Recreation can serve pretty tremendous ways, not simply through fantasy theme analysis or symbolic convergence theory, but overall. Any final thoughts on the text, or?
That's pretty much all I got. I feel like I kind of just jumped in a few parts, like here and there, but Parks and Rec was a really good example to show the fantasy themes of this type of popular culture. I think that we also shared a few other good examples of other TV shows that could influence us in a way to understand these themes a little bit better, but that's pretty much all I got. So yeah.
Very good. Well, if folks want to check it out, again, it's Crystal Fogel's
Chapter 11.
Knope versus Pope, a fantasy theme analysis of Scandal and Parks and Recreation in Communication Theory and Millennial Popular Culture, Essays and Applications, from editor Kathleen Glenister Roberts. Well, that is our mass communication and mass media perspectives conversation of the day. Thank you, Annabeth, for sitting
Of
in
course.
on this. And I'm looking forward to talking about a different kind of text with a different type of theory in our next sit down.
episode.
Yeah, looking forward to that and more here on Special Topics in Media.